Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm very pleased to welcome Travis Brown to the podcast. How are you doing, Travis?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me.
Some of my YouTube viewers may have noticed there's another companion joining us. Do you want to introduce this little furry fella?
Yeah,
it's a lady, actually.
It is. Yeah, this is Nora. She's my best little friend here, and she'll probably join us for most of it and crawl over me a little bit here. I'm laying down because I have debilitating back pain, and so it's hard for me to sit or stand for more than a few minutes at a time. So that's hence the bed.
Wow, it looks like we're sort of filming a very edgy System of a Down music video from this angle. It works. Well, I'm really looking forward to jumping into this project you've been working on recently on wokeness, titled the Woke Reformation. I've got that right, haven't I?
Yeah.
And it's a YouTube series, episodic, and I found it, not only does it highlight the issue, it does something that a lot of texts and people don't do on this issue, and it actually supplies advice, suggestions to combat it. So we can get into that momentarily, but I wasn't completely aware of your background. I mean, normally I could spend a whole episode talking about your move from sort of religious cult to where you are now. So, I mean, maybe you could tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do now, and a little bit about that world that you used to live in.
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in a small fundamentalist community out in Selah, Washington. It's a small town in eastern Washington. And we lived out in the middle of nowhere. And, in retrospect, it's a little challenging because at this point, my relationship with my parents has healed somewhat, and we were able to communicate and whatnot. So I don't say any of this to throw them under the bus, but it was a pretty intense upbringing. And, it was just very limited and controlled, and what I could and couldn't do, couldn't say, we couldn't really watch television. We could only listen to Christian music. I could only have Christian friends. I only had a couple of neighbors within about a mile radius because we lived out in the middle of nowhere. And I wasn't allowed to spend time with much of them most of the time because, my parents were afraid that they would lead me away from God. And, I wasn't allowed to read philosophy. I wasn't allowed to do a lot for fear of me leaving the faith. And
so they were right. Essentially,
more or less. Yeah. I mean, if you want to control somebody's mind, you keep out any potential influence that may lead them to question things. But I question things anyways, for whatever reason. There was a part of Christian morality that didn't sit right with me. In particular, my parents were somewhat Old Testament Christians in that they thought the Old Testament was still in part relevant to the present. And, there are aspects of, the genocidal acts of God and the Israelites that really bothered me. And I just didn't sit comfortably with it, and eventually started questioning it and really being concerned about it. And, for me, my exit out of the faith wasn't so much that I discovered there was no evidence for any of this and I didn't need to believe it. It was really more of a moral quandary. A lot of it just bothered me, and so eventually I left it behind when I was about 19 or 20, and then I came across people like Hitchens and Sam Harris and Dawkins, and then I was just so relieved to realize there's actually no reason for me to worry about this. When I left Christianity, I was still worried I was going to end up in hell because I believed in it that strongly, but I just couldn't in good conscience continue the faith because it didn't sit right with me. And then so again, I was relieved to find out that there was no evidence for any of it, and that kind of set me off on this path of discovering my own sense of meaning and purpose, and I think that's just so incredibly crucial, and that's something I try to address at least a little bit in my series, because I think there's a real lack of meaning in society, and I think there's a crisis of meaning at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something I want to touch on a little later on, this concept of meaning and where we are on that front now. So tell me a little bit about your filmmaking background then. What was it about that particular profession that you gravitated towards, and when did you think the best use of your time and skills would be to implement it in a way towards pushback to something you saw as harmful?
Yeah. Well, to take the first question first, I was always interested in film. We had little DV tape cameras that I would always mess around with and make goofy videos and do stop motion with my little army men figures and, paper cutouts, kind of like a crude South Park thing. And, we would record our voices over a VCR and dub it that way, and really old school. And, so I really enjoyed that. And then I got into martial arts, and I thought maybe I would be a stunt double or something like that. And I studied that for a while. But then I got really, as I was sort of leaving my faith behind, and got more interested in reading Nietzsche and, Krishnamurti and various Eastern philosophies, I decided that I should probably turn my attention toward writing and directing. And so that's really what interested me the most. And so I bought a camera and started messing around with it, and started writing, and I came out with my first film it made it in 2016, but it finally came out early this year, and it's called All Too Human, and based a little bit around Nietzsche's work and this character struggling with suicidal ideation and trying to kill himself over and over again and failing. It's a very dark comedy, but it's all around that idea of searching for something more and searching for meaning and rejecting the typical faith traditions.
Fascinating. I'll put that on my list for sure. So I suppose one of the things that this sort of woke movement has highlighted for me in recent years is how much it's actually not only divided, but in some way united certain people that were generally considered on opposite sides a while back. So I've been in the room with conservative Christians in recent years who have made more sense on these issues than my sort of left-leaning secular humanists. And we found common cause. And you yourself are, I'm assuming, a non-believer now, having come from that. So there's sort of this perception from the outside that those interested in woke ideology and combating it are sort of far right-leaning, or at least conservative Christians. And that's simply not true, is it?
No, not even remotely true. I mean, there are people concerned about it all over the map, left, right, and center. And that's just a way to shut down conversation. I've had my work called far right propaganda, and I'm pretty far from the far right. I'm fairly liberal, and I don't consider myself on the right. I don't have any problem with conservatives or anyone on the political spectrum, but yeah, it's just not true. And it's a way to shut down conversation or legitimate critique, really.
Yeah, it's weaponized as a smear, isn't it?
Yeah.
Does it at all make you uncomfortable then? So you're sort of a liberal, maybe in the American sense. I'm not sure. I think it differs slightly from the British or traditional understanding. I think, would you say libertarian's probably a better descriptor?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm hesitant to use any of the words just because I'm so allergic to groupthink that even calling myself a liberal makes me uncomfortable. But just generally speaking, I guess one could say I'm socially liberal, maybe somewhat fiscally conservative. So I don't know if that's classical liberal, somewhat libertarian in some ways, though I do think the government certainly has important roles in regulations and I'm not really one or the other. I just try to approach each issue as best I can, and I try really hard to not engage in the groupthink and not go along with this particular party or that party. So I've voted Republican and I've voted Democrat. It doesn't really matter to me. It's whoever I think is going to be best at the time.
Yeah, I think labels have become increasingly more difficult in the current climate. I'd be, several years ago, very comfortable describing myself as a progressive. Now I find that more of a dirty word. I mean, I am on the left, but I have to kind of reiterate when I tell people I'm on the left that I'm not the crazy left. So yeah, the labels are not very useful at the moment, except where they are. So I suppose one label that would be useful to define and get our heads around, really, or get your perspective on it, is this term woke, because at its inception, it was just used to mean people who are very socially aware, socially conscious, people who are interested in social justice, inequality, anti-racism, things like that. It's now become a term of mockery in some senses, an insult and a pejorative in others, which I think's well earned, to be fair. So how would you define wokeness? What is wokeness to you?
Yeah, well, like you touched on, I mean, the original meaning, in my view, was to be awakened to injustice, whether that's structural or personal slights or whatever it is, just to be aware of the problems within society that affect marginalized groups. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable goal. I think it has been weaponized, and I think James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose lay out the origins of this ideology really well. They call it critical social justice. I think it's a bit of a mouthful and a little confusing at times, but in their book Cynical Theories, where they talk about the origins of it largely from these French postmodern philosophers and the way in which postmodernism sort of transmuted into a new kind of activist ideology in the universities in about the 70s and 80s and 90s. So woke to me, I'm using really kind of as like a catch-all phrase for, like the anti-racist movement, the critical race theory, but not just about race. I lump in like the gender ideology, the trans ideology as well, and like fourth wave feminism, all of these identitarian movements that are so obsessed with identity and the oppressor versus oppressed narrative. So that's how I'm using it. And, I've gotten some flack for using that, but it, you have to choose a word to describe it. And that just seemed like the most appropriate word.
Yeah. God bless Helen and James for reading all that postmodernism, so
right.
We don't have to. Yeah. So I mean, that might be a good place to talk about postmodernism, because I think a lot of people think this movement or this ideology is fairly new. It's it's only just been born, and I suppose in certain ways it has, certainly in the public consciousness. But as you say, it's derived from a lot of postmodernist thought, specifically French, Foucault, people like that. So I mean, how much do we need to understand postmodernism to understand what's happening today, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would say for those who are really interested, then I try to read source material. I've read some of the original works, and some of Judith Butler and all these people who are almost unreadable, and it's really a pain in the ass. So I don't necessarily recommend people spend their time going through all of that, but I would recommend either reading Cynical Theories, which encapsulates the problem and really lays it out for people, or maybe checking out Jim's website, New Discourses, that gives an explanation for what a lot of this stuff is. Or I'm also working with Peter Boghossian on an upcoming series that will lay out a lot of this stuff in really simple, easy to understand terms. So it really depends on how much a person wants to kind of go down that rabbit hole in terms of understanding this. I think it's just I tried in the first episode, which I think is 6 or 7 minutes long, to to lay out the origins from something you could call like neo-Marxism to postmodernism to the newer activist scholars. And so I tried to make it really easily accessible for people so that they didn't have to go and read Foucault, or they didn't have to go and read Judith Butler or any of these just incomprehensible works. So I did my best to do that for people. I don't think it's crucial that people read the original work. I think just knowing that knowing who these postmodernists were and some of the basic principles is really fairly important, because then they can understand, like, well, what does lived experience mean? Or, my truth versus your truth. Like, these are ideas really embedded in postmodern, or that came from postmodernism, and that influence a lot of the dialogue that we see today.
Coming back to these episodes that you've created, and they can be found on YouTube under the Signal Productions, that's your YouTube channel. So what was your goal or intention with creating these episodes, and why did you bring in the specific people that you did?
Yeah, well, I started, as I said, with the origins of the ideology. So I thought it made sense to bring in Helen and James, since they're so well read and really foremost experts on this stuff. So I thought that was important. And I had filmed them when they came through town in Portland, which is the area that I live in, when they gave some talks here at Portland State University. And I liked what they had to say. And I just thought they would be good people to help people understand the the foundations for this stuff. So I thought that was a good place to start. And then Peter Boghossian, who the series is dedicated to, he's a friend of mine, really helped connect me with a number of people. I got very lucky that Douglas Murray was kind of doing a tour of the rioting and the insanity last year in the U.S. And he gave me 5 hours of his time, which was amazing. And so we did an interview and some conversations, and then from there, I was able to get some of the people that I really admire, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and her husband Neil Ferguson, and Nancy Rommelman and Azra Nomani, and I also made a friend with another local filmmaker who struggled a lot with this stuff. His name's Corey Drayton, and he's great. And I was really fortunate to get his story in the project. He's Black, but doesn't go along with BLM and has a lot of problems with diversity hiring and all of that. So we got his story, and I weaved that into the series. But my goal was to not only help people understand it, but as you said, offer tools to know what to do about it, so that I wasn't just presenting a problem and then just kind of leaving it out there for people. But I tried to present the problem, show how it's all interconnected, show where it leads, and then also what can be done about it. And so the last 2 episodes in particular focus on potential solutions for people. And that's what I've been focused on lately is giving people advice and helping them know what to do if they're concerned about this stuff. Yeah,
that's definitely always helpful. Thankfully, there's a lot more critical voices in this sphere, a lot more books and YouTube channels and things like that, but there's very little advice, explaining to people how they can push back and get involved. I suppose I was quite curious as well to ask how many parallels you can see between your previous life in a very conservative Christian environment versus what we're seeing with the coercive aspects of this new woke ideology. And I know the word religion's often bandied around a lot to describe ideologies that you're not keen with, but one of the things that drew me into this ideology was the way it did and does mimic certain religions, its own dogmas, blasphemy codes, heretics, things like that. Do you draw any direct lines between your Christian upbringing?
Yeah, I mean, that's largely why I got involved in the first place, because I did see some parallels that really bothered me. And it really started years ago for me, because I moved from my small town to Seattle and then Portland, to the wokest places on the planet.
I was just going to say, Seattle is frying pan into the fire, isn't it?
Yeah. And so even before Trump got elected, even before woke became a popular term, or anti-racism became a popular term, I just started noticing a lot of the same kind of dogmatic thinking and closed-mindedness and groupthink that I saw in my little fundamentalist community. I get some flack from Christians saying, "Oh, well, it's nothing like Christianity." And, in some ways it's certainly not. It's certainly not like mainstream Christianity. But the type of Christianity in which I grew up, where, I couldn't step out of line without being called evil and without being told I was going to burn in hell forever. And not even being able to just disagree with my father, for instance, without him telling me my heart was deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, which is a quote from Jeremiah 17:9. Those kinds of similarities definitely crop up, because you can't say the wrong thing on Twitter, or on the news, or even in your job. You could be fired for instance, using the N word in a context where you're saying you don't want anyone to use that word. I mean, just these really, frankly, silly rules around words and what can and can't be said. So, there's a similar, Ayaan in the series, and she made a PragerU video about this and wrote an article about it, but she draws some pretty straight lines between some aspects of fundamentalist Islam or Islamism and woke ideology. And it's fairly similar, in my opinion, to some of the things that I grew up with, and the heresy aspect would be one of them. And then just thinking outside of the group and questioning certain things. You're certainly not allowed to do that. If you have a question about whether or not trans women should be MMA fighters with biological women, for instance, or questioning any of that immediately makes you suspect and gets you kind of thrown out of the group. And so there are similarities there because once I started questioning it, I had to leave my religion behind and felt very ostracized. So there were similarities there. There's the idea of original sin, which is something that you're born with. I was taught that we're all just fallen creatures and that we deserve to suffer for eternity. And it was only through the grace of God that we were able to wash our sins clean. The difference with the woke religion is that there is no salvation, there is no redemption. So I often like to say it takes the worst parts of fundamentalist religion, fundamentalist Christianity, and leaves out the best parts because there is no forgiveness. It lacks that part of it, which is really sad. So yeah, I think there are a lot of similarities. I guess I would say the similarity to the original sin would be being born with a particular identity, cis, straight, white, able-bodied male, the various descriptors make you kind of part of the bad group that you're born with, and there's no real way to, as I said, redeem that or get rid of that negative aspect of yourself. And that's really one of the flaws with this cultish religion is that there's no way to come back from any mistakes. So there's no way to progress, and I just think it's really unhealthy.
Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, you touched on, as one of your examples there, biologically born men competing as women in contact sports. And there was a lot regarding this gender ideology a few years ago where people concerned about the end point of it were sort of dismissed as reactionaries or scaremongers. And today, the kind of things we were warning against seem to be mainstream. For instance, in the UK now, our main political opposition party, the Labour Party, is currently embroiled in a very public row about whether or not it's transphobic to say only women have a cervix. So that's where we are. That's what's consuming our time. That's what's having people ostracized from our most left-leaning liberal opposition party. So I suppose my question is, how have we gone in such a short speed to something that was nowhere to something that is saturating all our institutions, all our media, all our political discussion?
Yeah, I would say in large part, and this could apply to many issues, is fear. People are afraid of saying the wrong thing because if they do, they're ostracized, they're castigated, they're heretics essentially, or blasphemers in this religion. Because if you, as I said, like if you question that, if you question whether biologically born men should be fighting biologically born women, that's a problem. And so if speech is quelled and you can't bring these issues up and you can't talk about them, then the next thing you know, they're going to push for something a little bit more extreme. And the next thing you know, they say things like, bodies with vaginas instead of women, or, things like that, which are just totally absurd. And, a lot of feminists say that they're erasing women. And I think in part that's true. And yeah, I think it comes from a culture of fear mongering, and it makes total sense, as I've said many times to my friends and elsewhere, that these people are really good at marketing. So they use terms like Antifa and anti-racism because they work really well. Because how could you be against Antifa? It just means you're against fascism. How could you not be anti-racist? And the same is true for these other gender ideologies and all that. Like, well, you don't want to be inclusive, and so people are afraid and they don't speak out. And then therefore the next thing you know, more and more of the language has been conceded, and people are saying absurdly ridiculous things because no one wants to say, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. So people are afraid, I think.
How do we empower the ordinary working man or woman to push back in the workplace? Because I work in a corporate environment and I've seen the creep of some of these workshops and recommendations and this As you say, the push for diversity and inclusion, which are things that I value, but they often don't mean them things. It's obviously it's often rather a way of sneaking in rather nefarious far left politics. How do we empower or sort of encourage people to speak up? And because we would be lying if we were to suggest there was no risk involved personally and professionally for doing so.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Sometimes people could speak out and they may be surprised that a lot more people agree with them than they thought. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that, as I've been making this series, I've had crippling anxiety. I live in Portland. There's a lot of Antifa here. I've had my mind to sort of run away with itself, thinking like, fuck, is somebody going to dox me and find my address and like show up? And, I've had these fears, and it's caused a lot of insomnia and a lot of problems. But I've done it anyways because I think it's really important. And so, there is a risk, but I think people have to ask themselves if they want to live an authentic life or if they want to go along with the mob. And I think that's a decision every person has to make. But in small ways, if you don't want to risk your whole career, what you can do is just start asking certain questions and ask them genuinely. I've been talking with my girlfriend about this and other people who are entering school or entering these new jobs and that are worried about this stuff. And my advice often is, thankfully I'm not in that position and I'm able to just make films about it. But it's, so I realize I'm in a privileged position here to a degree. But yeah, when people say words like equity or inclusion, I would ask, well, what exactly does that mean? And try to get to the bottom of that. And then I think that signals to other people in the room that like, it's okay to question these things and, you don't have to worry so much. And then, ultimately, if it does come down to, well, you don't want to participate in this DIE training or being told that you're a racist just for having white skin or whatever the situation is, like, it really is worth considering. Like, do you want to keep that job? Do you trust that that's going to be a good company for you to work in? Do you want your kids to go to that school? I mean, I think these are fair questions. I mean, I know a lot of people who've changed school districts or pulled their kids out of school because of this stuff. And so I think when more and more people do it, they'll find that more people agree with them than not. Most people are going to go along with it, but when you speak out, you find that there are a lot of people who thank you for doing that because they don't feel that they could do it. So I think the more people that do it, the better off we are. And then also I would just say, again, is it really worth keeping that job or staying in that school or that church or that group if you can't be yourself and if you have to kowtow to this profoundly illiberal ideology?
To play devil's advocate a little bit, so on one hand, we've got an issue where there are many people who are silenced because they're afraid of their livelihoods rather, and their job security. Then we have a number of people who assume this is all just one big academic issue. It's a college issue, it's a university issue, it's a youth issue. These people on the streets rattling the sabers and smashing up Starbucks and shouting about the patriarchy and white privilege, the kids, and they'll grow out of it and we'll all move on and be fine. What's the best arguments you can give as to why that isn't the case?
I mean, I'm surprised when people say that in 2021. I mean, you might have been able to say that in 2016. But,
yeah.
Just seeing, I don't know, I'm inundated in this stuff because I'm researching it. I'm finding clips and I'm reading headlines. And so, it's possible I have a slightly biased viewpoint, but I will say that these ideas are not just in colleges anymore. You can hear in just everyday language these terms that these activists invented, like lived experience, the systemic oppression. Like you can hear those terms everywhere, and so many workplaces are now having the diversity, equity, inclusion training. So many schools are teaching something that has at least been influenced by critical race theory. The retort is, well, no one's teaching critical race theory. That's a theory for law school and whatnot. But the reality is it is a philosophy that has spread out into K through 12 schools, even if they're not teaching the original things that Derek Bell or Richard Delgado or Kimberly Crenshaw said. That these ideas are out there, and they're not just in colleges. And I mean, there are so many examples of children being segregated into these groups of oppressor versus oppressed, or privileged versus not privileged, or a victim. And there are just countless examples of this. So I would just encourage people to look those examples up and to see what's happening there, and noticing it in our politics, at least the United States. I think before the election, Kamala Harris tweeted out something about equity, a video about equity. And I think Biden implemented something as far as, I think, possibly both with the vaccines and helping people, businesses due to COVID with finances. He wanted to help people of color first, and things like that. Like that is a direct outgrowth from this ideology. And it's frankly very concerning and very strange, and is only going to raise tensions. Like that's just not a good solution. So, I mean, in my view, you can see it, not only in elementary schools, but at the top of government. I mean, you can see the Oscars now for a while have been rigged so that you have to have certain immutable character, a certain number of people with certain immutable characteristics, even to be qualified for the Oscars. I mean, this stuff is everywhere. It just takes a little bit of attention to see it.
Yeah, for sure. The Oscars is pretty much unwatchable now, not because of the forced categories, but the preaching from the podium and all this.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing. They all seem to agree with each other. Who'd have thought it? Talking of agreeing with each other, one of the things that I value about the episodes that you produced on the Woke Reformation is this idea of actually engaging with people you have disagreements with, but doing so in a way that might be fruitful rather than adversarial, and in a way that won't particularly cause friction. And one of the ways that you do this is to suggest a lot of the methods Peter Boghossian popularized in his book, I think that was in collaboration with James Lindsay as well, Impossible Conversations. It's very Socratic in its method, asking questions, these various techniques. Now, one of the things that I find to be true, which is paradoxical, and I have to really struggle to get myself out of the habit, is to invoke stats and data, because when we're talking about these issues, the issues of inequality, racism, social structure, we're talking about data, we're talking about numbers, we're talking about progression, things like that. And it's very easy to just grab a data chunk on police shootings or progression of women's rights and things like that. But what we find is when we do this psychologically, it makes the other person more entrenched in their beliefs rather than persuades them. So how do we better have these conversations where we're not point scoring, we're not trying to find a winner at the end of the day, we're trying to move other people to a more reasonable place?
Yeah, I would say the first thing is to check one's attitude. Do we really just want to score points and feel better about our position and kind of get one over on somebody? I mean, if that's the approach, then it might be fun for a while, but you're not going to convince anyone really most of the time, and two, you might create more enemies, and you also, as you said, might entrench them more in their beliefs. I think there's a time and place for stats, but as you alluded to, it can lead to the backfire effect. So if someone says something, oh, there's thousands of people, or blacks are just being hunted by the police, or something like that, which is patently absurd. If you point out that, oh, well, it's something like 12 unarmed black people were killed in 2019 by the police, and some of them weren't even really unarmed, and that they had cars or whatever. Doing that, especially early in the conversation, is likely just to have them find another way to justify the belief. Maybe they'll just question the stats or whatever it is. They'll come up with some reason why that doesn't change their mind. And that's just how our brains work, because when we're attacked, when our ideas are attacked, we hunker down and we want to protect our beliefs, which totally makes sense. And there's an evolutionary reason for that. So the best thing to do is one, come at these conversations from a friendly disposition, not trying to just change someone's mind or just show them that they're wrong, but actually be curious. Like, okay, well, that's really interesting. Why do you believe that? Why do you believe blacks are being hunted by the police? And then you can have a conversation about the media's narrative, perhaps, and ask some questions about that. But the key is definitely an attitudinal disposition and asking questions, not like targeted questions that feel like you're attacking the person, but genuine questions of genuine curiosity as to why people believe what they do. And then, Pete and James give several techniques that you can use beyond that, like asking people to put their belief on a scale, and then asking them why they're not lower on the scale or they're not higher on the scale, for instance. And there's a number of techniques that I help outline in a couple of the episodes. But that's a good start, I think, to have the right attitude, and to also remember that, like, most of these people aren't charlatans. People like Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi are, I would say. But most of the people who believe this stuff, they believe it because they think it's the morally correct position to take. They think they're being good people. Their morality has been hijacked. So it's really important to remember, like, the reason people are believing this and advocating for this stuff is because, like, of course, Black Lives Matter, or of course we want to care about trans people. And of course, and so I think we have to accept that and realize that people want to do good, and their motivations, generally speaking, the average person has good motivations in this. And that's a key thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's some good advice. I wrote a review on my blog of Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, and I'm trying to think about a way to say this diplomatically, but I learned nothing from it, and I didn't expect that to be the case. I've gone into books where people have tried to make an argument for creationism and the existence of a God, which are much better argued and cause for thought and a lot smarter. I couldn't believe how vapid it was and how void of any reasonable arguments. I remember writing at the time that I was so afraid that it may have actually subtracted some knowledge from me by reading it. So I think to throw her on the sort of charlatan pile, I think is fair. But we have the problem that that's the go-to book now. That's being recommended in workplaces. It's been it's recommended to one of our largest supermarket chains in the UK to their employees. And what's the best solution to that sort of thing when somebody, an employer, a person in authority, suggests one of these texts and kind of makes it a mandatory point of your employment to pick it up and absorb it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Douglas Murray has a couple pieces of advice that are in this, that is in the series, I think in the 7th episode. And he suggests, the softer approach would be to say, well, that's interesting. If you'd like me to read this book, I have a book that you should read, and you can give them something by, Thomas Sowell, like Discrimination and Disparities, or any of the books that question the very foundation of the anti-racist ideology and dogma. I don't know how well that would work. I mean, they have to be open-minded enough to actually do that. But that would at least put a little wedge in there. Or you could share it with other employees, saying like, okay, hey, we're forced to read this book, but here's another book that you could read that questions some of this stuff. So, maybe you can at least find some friends to share these books with. He suggested on the harder end of things to just say, no, I'm not going, this has nothing to do with working at a supermarket. This has nothing to do with being, giving change or sweeping the floor or whatever administrative tasks you want me to do. This has nothing to do with any of that. So there's no reason for me to read this, and that could be a scary thing to do, but it's certainly an option, I would say.
One of the subjects of your film you spoke about briefly earlier, Corey Drayton, he's director of photography as a profession, just so happens to be black, clearly has no time for identity politics.
Right.
Now, he actually speaks something which I've noticed too over the years, and that's it doesn't really matter to the woke mob whether you are black. They have this idea of the authentically black person in their head, the authentically unauthorized black opinions, and they will enforce them, it seems, even towards people they claim to be fighting for or claim to represent. And he shares an anecdote of a situation where he feels he was actually let go from work because he said he wasn't in support of Black Lives Matter. So
right.
How do we explain this hypocrisy? We have a black man here who's in employment, someone these people claim to champion and care about and wish to empower and listen to, yet they will cut him loose as soon as he strays from the approved script. How can they not see this double standard where they're basically defending Black Lives Matter by firing a black man?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it just shows you the absurdity of the ideology. And the truth is that it's an ideology. It's actually not about caring about Black people. It's actually not so much about caring about racism or sexism or any of the claims that they make. It's really an authoritarian ideology that says you need to fall in line or else. And if you don't, it doesn't matter what your color is, what gender identity you have, like those things actually don't matter. So I think people need to realize that I've said this before, that they use these causes like anti-racism as tools, as bludgeons to get their way. And it's not so much actually about, for some people, it is about those things. They really do think, oh, well, I care about Black people and therefore Black Lives Matter is an organization I'm going to support. But if you do a little bit more digging, you realize that, for instance, a lot of the money that was raised for the BLM cause has been spent on houses and other things that have nothing to do with helping disenfranchised Black people. I think John McWhorter is somebody who's good at addressing this stuff, and he happens to be Black. He's a linguist and a race commentator, and he gets infuriated that these talking points and these problems really don't help poor Black kids. They don't help the people that they're claiming to help. And he has a really good way of kind of laying that out. So I'd recommend anyone who doesn't know John McWhorter's work, I recommend him and Glenn Lowry, his conversation partner.
So the big one, I suppose, which we touched on at the start of the discussion, was this void of meaning in modern life. In the materialistic world, we've killed God, essentially. We've got a lot of freedom. We're not going to war, really. There's, oppression's at an all-time low in the Western world, and we have all this free time. And what do we fill it with? Because I spend a lot of my time challenging and opposing institutions that can't be challenged. The chief amongst them was fundamental religion, still is for me, especially how Islam pertains to the West, the UK and Europe more specifically. So once we've tore all these down and we're left with the freedom we demand, what do we do with our time? How do we find meaning? How do we fill this God-shaped hole?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably one of the most important questions facing humanity, honestly, because without the answer, I think it clearly leads to a lot more sectarianism and a lot more dogmatic politics and politics as religion. And I think, while I really like some of the people in the, new atheist movement, and I liked a lot of the books and the debates, I think one of the flaws with it was not offering something meaningful in its place. I think Sam Harris tried to do that. I think he's maybe the only one that I'm aware of, with a kind of almost Buddhist mentality. He tried to talk about spirituality and meaning, and yet, I think, for the most part,
Richard Dawkins floated the Brights for a while. Do you remember that?
Oh, vaguely, yeah. But none of them were really good solutions. I think, and so it's hard. I mean, what can unify people and give them a sense of, meaning, spiritual meaning. You can use that word if you want. I tend to be, hesitant to use that word, but I do think it's still applicable even without the supernatural. So I don't really believe in the supernatural, but I think spirituality is important. So, it's hard to answer except for on a individual by individual basis. And that's the problem. That's the key problem, because we are a social species, and, it's easy to say things like, oh, art and music and pursuing what you love and all of that. And those are really important. And I think people need to do those things. But there's, without a sense of community that ties you together, it's hard to have a good answer for that question. I was really fortunate that even though I left behind my religious community, I was able to build and find new communities, both within the film industry here, as well as my martial arts community. I sort of found my own second family and community, and people that supported me and were there for me no matter what. And so that has been crucial for me. And, some people are unlucky in that, and they don't have that. I would say that the community aspect is just really crucial, and people should really value that and try to find a meaningful whether you call it a spiritual community or just a meaningful community to engage with and be a part of, whether that's a family or a group of friends, and often that involves some activity that you do together. And I think that's important. Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about that, whether it's sports or for me it was martial arts, or whatever it is. I think I don't have a great answer. I think that for me, when I lost my faith, I went through a real crisis and got to the place where I almost killed myself because I was so depressed and it was so difficult, and I just completely lost my navigation system and also any sense of value and meaning and all of that. And so it took it was a really difficult journey, and I don't necessarily wish that on everyone, but that's what it took for me to really derive my own, to kickstart my own journey to find a sense of value and meaning, and one that I think is pretty unshakable in the sense of it's not something that I worry about anymore. Like I have a very clear vision of what I want to do with my life and what gives me meaning, and everyone I think needs that. And I think it's just really tragic that people are finding what for some people is called social justice, when in fact it's really not that.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer, and I'm very glad that you are somebody who knows their own mind and has come through that to the other side to be able to produce content to such a quality and level that you have on this issue. One of the things that, for me, which I sort of agreed with but was left a little bit uncomfortable for reasons that I'm not sure I can articulate, so I'll probably just bounce them off you for your opinion. But you had someone like Niall Ferguson, very articulate, bright individual, and he made a great point about how a lot of the totalitarian, fascist, violent movements originated in places of study, academic institutions, and that was a very valuable point. But then we sort of alluded to Pol Pot, and then I think Michael Shermer later on talks about the Holocaust as the end point, and I don't necessarily disagree with how far such an illiberal ideology can take us, but at the same time there will be people who will look at that and say, well, that's hyperbole, that's extremist, that's taking this too far. And did you have any sort of reservations about alluding to sort of the Holocaust and Pol Pot and things like that?
A little bit, yeah. No, I totally understand the discomfort. I don't think it's obviously not there at the moment. I do think, as they say, that it certainly can lead to that. Not that it will. And I suspect that there's enough of a pushback and that is too extreme that it won't lead there. I really kind of put that in as a warning of this is where this kind of ideology can lead. Not that it's inevitable and not that it's even necessarily going to happen. But when people start dividing each other and start having a utopian ideal, it is true that, we'll sacrifice just about anything for a true utopia. And if that utopia comes with dividing people by race and gender and sexuality and all of these things, and saying who's good and who's bad, you have these really kind of crackpot cases usually, but you have some people saying things like they wish they could kill all white people, or, this one teacher who said that she was happily thinking about emptying a gun into any white person that came in front of her. You see, even though that's, I would say, the fringe, it's alarming to see and hear that kind of stuff. And so I think it's just at least something to keep in the back of our minds that, this ideology and this way of categorization and really of saying, there's the evil and the righteous, and we need to pursue the righteous at all costs, like that is a huge problem, and it can lead to justifications of murder, which we have seen, and so it is a bit extreme, I will say, but I do think it's a fair thing to at least keep in mind as a warning, and hopefully just as something that motivates people to not let it get to that point. And that was really kind of my reasoning for including that.
Yeah, it wasn't sort of presented as sort of a frothy-mouthed premonition or anything. It was very reasonable. Obviously, just invoking them things is always a source of discomfort, as it should be. So we have this huge ideology now that's well subscribed to. It has its lieutenants and its generals, and these mobs and these threats of violence, like you say. And I think Azrin Amani makes the point the strongest, I think, in your work about how this ideology will come for its proponents. Eventually, it eats its own tail. Nobody's safe. And why is that exactly? Why do we have a situation where there are some ideologies that are irrational or not particularly conducive to public good, but don't tend to reach their own, versus this one ideology who will wait for anyone to step out of line and then devour them?
Yeah, in that way, it kind of does remind me of some of the fundamentalists that I grew up with, who were so self-righteous that anyone who didn't meet their standard, they could say, well, you're going to hell, or you're not going to make it, or, it was actually kind of a similar modality. And so in that, I mean, that was very puritanical. And what we see in the woke ideology, the woke movement, is a kind of puritanism, and not being able to be pure enough. And if you're not pure enough, well, then we're going to cast you out. You have to keep, there's that phrase, do the work, by the anti-racists. They always say do the work, which is often not explicitly defined, but it's something like constantly looking at yourself to see what sins you've committed, or how you've been racist, or how you've been sexist, or how you've transgressed. And so it's sort of just built in, I think, to the ideology that we have to constantly be looking at our own problems and looking for problems for other people. And it must be an element of human psychology. I don't think I can give the best reason why that is, but people just want to be pure, and they want to be the purest of the pure. And so that just leads to, as you say, like eating their own, and, casting certain people out, and just, it ultimately just leads to more division and more divisiveness, and it's not cohesive. So that may be an element that causes this whole thing to fall apart at some point. It's hard to say.
Yeah, an implosion would be good, I would say. But yeah, Travis, we've gone from a sort of a point where people were denying wokeness was even a thing, cancel culture didn't exist, etc., to it basically absorbing everyone's time now. And it's good to see not only a lot of critical content being produced, but especially valuable content where you offer suggestions and advice, and equip people with the tools and rhetoric to push back in whatever environment they come into contact with this new progressive utopia. So thank you for that. And I'll recommend it to all my viewers and listeners to go and check it out. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Is there anything else you'd like to point people towards, or talk about, or get off your chest before I let you get back to your afternoon?
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. I would just point to my locals, which is the wokereformation.locals.com. And I've got a lot of like long form interviews, interviews with Douglas Murray and Peter Boghossian, and I've got one with Ayaan Hirsi Ali coming out soon. And so there's a lot more there for paid subscribers than just the episodes. And I give also a lot more tips and tools and example videos on how to use some of these techniques and that sort of thing. So if anyone is interested, check that out as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Travis. And all the best for a speedy recovery for your back as well.
Thank you. I appreciate it.